I'm currently working on making an underseat subwoofer enclosure for a truck that will hold 4 10-inch subwoofers. In the last video, we went step by step and we came up with this design. Now we could very easily just wrap this enclosure with carpet and install it into the vehicle and have a very cool build. But you guys know that here on this channel, I like to spice things up a little bit more, and we're going to be doing some cosmetic features along with some beauty panels. All of this is in an effort to make the subwoofer enclosure look like it belongs as part of the vehicle. So in this video, we're going to get into those details and we're going to come up with a plan. Now, real quick, before we get into the content, I do want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Audio Control, and tell you guys a little bit more about their LC2i Pro. If you're installing an aftermarket subwoofer with an aftermarket amplifier as part of a factory car audio system, you need a way to take that factory speaker level signal and convert it into an RCA low level signal. Now you guys probably know for that you would use a line output converter, which is what the LC2i Pro is, but this gives us a ton of extra features. Some factory audio systems will not continue to pass a signal if it doesn't detect that a speaker is connected, so this has a load selection switch so we can simulate a speaker still being installed. Audio Control also gives us options for the trigger mode to turn this device on. Additionally, there's a ground isolation switch, but another very important feature is they give us the Accu based control. A lot of factory car audio systems, as you turn up that volume, it actually reduces the bass. They do this to protect their inexpensive stock speakers, but if we're upgrading, we want that bass to continue to turn up as we turn up the volume, and we can restore that with the Accu bass. There's a ton more detail to go into and explain on the LC2i Pro. If you guys want to learn more, check out the link to the video that I made recently here on the channel down in the video description. Alright guys, so here we have our finished design, and if you watched the last video, you know that I like to start with showing you guys the finished design. That way you kind of have an idea what we're working towards as we go through each of these steps. So I'm going to be kind of brief here, but check out, we have a design on the side here. Kind of remember what this looks like in your mind, and then we also have a design on the front here. Again, kind of look at those angles and the fact that there's a lot of chamfered edges. Keep that in mind because we're going to get into the vehicle DNA. Something I like to do when coming up with the design for the beauty panels and the different cosmetic features of a build is just take a couple of pictures in the interior. This first picture here that you guys can see, this is of the door sill area. So in other words, that lower area as you open the door, and you can see that they have this very characteristic truck look right here. There's very aggressive hard edges and lines, and you probably already recognized it. This is the shape that I end up going for on the sides of the enclosure. Now taking a look at this picture of the door panel, pay attention again, there's a lot of straight lines, not really a whole lot of arcs, everything's pretty straight, and then it just kind of has a radius rounding out each of the corners. And then notice that there's a lot of chamfered parts of this design. This up here is a chamfer, it's not a roundover, it's a chamfer. Same on the armrest here, same on this lower pocket area. Even this side here, as you go from where the speaker face is to this little detail, again, that's a chamfer. Tons of chamfers all on this door panel, so I definitely want to kind of match that as I go through my design. Finally, looking at the dash and some of the dash vents here, notice that this is a pretty common theme where it's kind of a rectangle with one of the corners cut off at an angle. In fact, if we go back to the door sill here, again, rectangle with the cut off angle. And even with the design of the door here, this is almost an overall square and it's got that cut off angle. That particular angle seems to be pretty consistent, so that's something that I want to incorporate as well. So if you watched the last video, this is basically where we left off. We have ourselves a nice down-firing enclosure. It's got bracing on the inside, and of course it's got an angle cut on top of it because it is going to be sitting underneath the seat. And then it has these rounded corners in both of the front edges in order to match up with the front corners of the seat. That way it's not kind of sticking out at a hard corner there, it actually matches. The first thing that I decided to kind of consider here is I wanted to think about how I was going to transition the different materials. So I knew that on the top of the enclosure, I just want to carpet the top of this here. The carpet will do a better job of being durable as the seat folds back against the enclosure several times if that was to be a vinyl top all the way across, you could end up with some lines as the seat kind of rubs against the top of the enclosure when people are sitting on it. We want to keep everything nice and durable, so I want to use carpet for the top surface there, but I want this to have a refined, nice look, so I know I want to use vinyl for the front and sides. So for that reason, I need to have myself a transition gap where I can wrap the carpet from the front and sides of the enclosure and tuck it in and then transition to the carpet. So what I did is I modeled myself in a nice little 1/8 inch gap that I'm going to make using a router when I go to actually build this enclosure. Now, if we look at the back side of the enclosure here, so far where I modeled this to, it kind of ends right here. I need it to transition around the back side of the enclosure because I want my vinyl to wrap around this corner and have the back side be carpet as well. So I also created a sketch and extrusion to make that cutting path too. We always want to be thinking about our finishing materials as much as we can as we go through this process. So on the sides of the enclosure, I wanted to add these features here. Again, the design intent being to match the side of the door sill. I wanted to make sure that when I added these details to the box, they were very similar in appearance, not only in the way they looked, but the way they were scaled. So I made sure that I took a couple of quick dimensions of the actual vehicle, of those little notches on the door sill there, and I used those same dimensions in order to get the same angle as well on our actual design. Now I want to make sure that these details really have some dimension to them, so what I've done is this is going to be actually made from 2 different pieces. So this surface here and behind those pieces, that's going to be one piece, and it is a 1/4 inch thick. If we do a quick measurement here, you can see 1/4 inch. And then these details on the front that I will cut out, these are actually only an 1/8 inch thick. So overall, it's going to be 3/8 inch thick on those parts right there that we're going to wrap with vinyl, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but once we put the vinyl over them, it's going to have quite a bit of dimension. Now again, remember that angle that we talked about earlier that we wanted to incorporate? You can see that that is why I've added that there. I've also modeled in some chamfers because again, there's a ton of chamfers throughout the interior of this vehicle, which I can easily just do with a chamfer bit on the router once I actually make these pieces. And now look how this angle here is very similar to this angle on the outside of this overall insert. To come up with this insert, I started out with creating this sketch on the front of the enclosure. I then extruded that into this piece that I'll be making. And since this is an insert, I want it to actually insert into this outer ring here. So I had to model up that ring by just doing an offset of this geometry. And what's cool here is I don't necessarily have to actually make this ring out of wood. I could just use fiberglass materials like body filler and go around the outside of this shape here, or I could cut it out of wood to probably save some time, which is what I'll likely end up doing. And once I cut that piece out of wood and add a large chamfer, we basically have a simulated body filler insert made out of wood, which should save us some time. And I will probably end up adding some body filler around the outside anyway, just to really smooth everything out completely so that you don't notice this hard edge wrapped in the vinyl. It will give it more of kind of a perfect look. But regardless, now we have that insert surrounded by an outer chamfer. Now again, because those chamfers are so common, we do want to add a chamfer on the inside of this viewing window here. And the plan is on the inside here, I want to have some acrylic that's going to have, the logo and the different companies that are sponsors of this build. In the meantime, you can see I've also modeled these 3 lines here. And what those end up being, if we step a little bit further through our design history, is these end up being some additional details that I'm going to make with a bullnose bit using the router on the front of this piece. Now I of course want those details to carry over to both sides of the enclosure, so I'm going to mirror that feature as well. One of the reasons I really like planning out all the different router pass cuts that I'm going to be making is you can just get a feel for the final geometry. This would be something that would be hard to really kind of visualize in your head, how these different arcs end up combining with this chamfer right here. But when we actually model it and model those cuts, we can see how that's going to look when we build it. And I actually kind of like the way that this looks. I think it looks kind of non-organic, but interesting and cool. And I think it continues to carry that design DNA of having the chamfers, but in this case, we're combining it with something a little bit different that adds some additional extra flair. Now I want to make sure that I have a plan for how this acrylic piece is going to fit inside of our insert there. So what I've done, if we go ahead and hide the subwoofer box and turn this around, you can see that I've modeled that piece of acrylic in there. And if I hide it, what I've done is I've cut myself a nice little pocket on the inside that acrylic can sit into. Again, it's good to get a feel for all these different dimensions and the different size router bits that you're going to need to use to cut all of these different locations for our different pieces to fit together. Now I've made plans for how the vinyl is going to transition from the front and the sides to the top of the enclosure with that slot we talked about earlier, but what about the bottom of the enclosure? We need to consider that as well. And right now, you know, that vinyl would have to kind of come over this hard edge, and this is on the bottom side of the enclosure, so obviously you're never going to see it. It's going to be resting against the floor, but we do kind of want to have a good plan of attack here. So I do want to soften up this edge. Now this is a problem though, because if I run this on the router, let's think about this. I can have these edges rounded over, no problem. I can come around this side, have that rounded over, no problem. But once I start to transition over here, it's going to get weird looking on these. If I add a round over, we want those to have that nice hard edge still. So what I can do is I can actually model a round over on this part. You know, you can see it carrying through there, but let's do a little bit more detailed round over on this here. We can see we transition from a full round over to nothing, and we can do that on the router just by stopping our router bit. If we stop the router bit right here, we're going to have a nice transition from this smooth rounded edge to our design DNA that we're going for of that hard edge corner. Now I probably will take a little bit of sandpaper and just kind of make my own edge here and finesse it in, again, just so that it's not super sharp. It gives a little bit of a rounded edge. I may even use a really small round over bit on that edge just to kind of finesse the details and make it look perfect. So that's our full enclosure design. So we have a plan now. Now we can build this box, which will be the next videos here on the channel. Next time you want to add an aftermarket amplifier to a factory car audio system, definitely check out the Audio Control LC2i Pro. You can learn more about this at the link down in the video description. A special thanks to Audio Control, along with Anthony, Mike, Mo, Jerry, Marcos, William, and the rest of the Patreon membership team. A big thanks to all those guys for making these videos possible. And as always, my friends, thank you guys for tuning in and watching, and I will see you in the next video.